Welcome to the Campus Outreach Staffcast. I am your host, John Elam, and with me is the Campus Outreach Serve Executive Director, Kent Bailey. Good to have you, Kent.
Thank you, John. And today we are really happy to have Al Barth with us. And Al and I'm not really sure exactly how many times we've ever been in the same room together, but we have had a lot of influential conversations along the way, Al, and I've really always been thankful for that. And just the influence you've had on my life and on Campus Outreach and on churches around the world. So really excited about the chance to get to have a conversation that a lot of other people are going to get to hear as well today.
Great. Well, I'm glad to be here, Kent, and thanks, John, for facilitating all this.
That's great. Well, Al, it'd probably be good for you to give just a bit of a bio on yourself, a bit of history, family, where you are now, what you're doing, just for some context for all the CO staff.
Yeah, you get me started on that, and I'll talk for 30 minutes, so I won't do that. But very quick is, for the last 24, 25 years, I've been working with an organization in New York to help plant churches, urban center churches, in the leading cities of North America, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I got involved in Asia a bit with my co-conspirator, Jay Kyle, years ago. But essentially, I took responsibility for everything west of Dubai and westwards. He took everything, responsibility for everything east of that, and then he took on South America. But then secondly, I'm currently the director of church planting at Spanish River Church in Boca Raton. A lot of people know they've financed a tremendous number of church plants. And then on the side, I've been developing an initiative working with Native American and First Nations folks of the U.S. and Canada. So those are the kinds of things I'm involved. I planted 4 churches over my pastoral career, ordained the PCA. I was licensed to the Evangelical Free Church. I've been around a bit, so.
And the operative word there always seems to be catalyst, that wherever you are catalyzing for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom, and that's exciting. So, Al, I would love for you to press pause there to go a little deeper into the Spanish River story, because that is one that I think our staff around the world, would be interested to hear, but need to know about. And probably for most of them would almost be, because what Spanish River has been so expansive, but also been so humbly done. Like nobody knows that it's Spanish River that's done all this. And probably the only place that many of them would have heard of Spanish River, unfortunately, was its reference in the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast and the story of David Nicholas.
Yep.
So could you go even that far back to tell David's story, give a little bit of the Spanish River story, because this is a church that has had a profound impact around the world and people need to know the story.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll give you the highlights. 1967, David and his wife, Nori, came to Boca Raton to plant a church. He struggled for 3 or 4 years trying to get that church established. There were a group of us that all came to Christ during 1972 from a number of different means and such. And we had all come out of we were wannabe hippies is what I would say, so some had been experimental with drugs and, all that kind of stuff. And some of us were troubled in terms of, running away from home, all that kind of stuff. Anyways, we invaded Spanish River in 1972. Then there were about 35, 40 of us. And David was smart enough, wise enough to approach the people of the church. So Spanish were about 80 people, and most of them were retirement, 65 and older. All the men literally wore 3-piece suits at that point in time. It was very traditional service, all that kind of thing. So here we come in. Tie-dyed shirts, blue jeans. Some of us are barefoot. David goes to the older people of the congregation. He said, listen, this is the next generation that we need to reach. And although they're going to look funny, they talk funny, they're going to have long hair, we need to make sure that we don't send any negative signals. You need to think about these kids as if they were your grandchildren. Well, that's what they did. So there was no rolling of any eyes. It was just so warmly welcoming. So we come into the church, and David just gives us license to do a number of things. He ends up letting us create an evening service. Larry Crabb, some of you know him as the counselor. Larry began to preach for that service. Wow. And very quickly, within, I think, a year and a half, that service was, the church was well over 400 people. And we had introduced things like guitars and drums and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's almost weird to think about what the church looked like back then, just generally. But we were part of that kind of revolution that took place in 1972. Fast forward it. David realizes as the PCA is formed and Spanish River pulled out of the PCUSA, became one of the founding churches of the PCA in 73. David, when the whole denomination knew that if we were ever going to make an impact on the United States, we needed to plant new churches. And a lot of the churches that left lost their buildings, so they were in effect in a church planting mode. So David, being a church planter himself, begins to help fund, and not just David, the church begins to help fund, church plants. By 1980, there was a switch in kind of what Spanish River was doing. Up until that point, they were funding cross-cultural missionaries with not only MTW, World Harvest, some others, but they made a switch to coming alongside of indigenous church planters, national church planters, to help them do in their situation what Spanish River was trying to do in its situation. And so in 1980, they made this switch. They actually would end up no longer supporting cross-cultural missionaries, even though they recognized the value of them. There were many other churches that were doing that, but they felt like they needed to focus on planting new churches, not only in the U.S., but actually across the world. And that group of church planters became a network, which was initially called the Spanish River Network. That grew until, I guess it was the late 90s. And that's when David, although Spanish River was very much helping to plant PCA churches, David was a little frustrated with that limitation. So what he wanted to do was plant churches that weren't only PCA, but also other churches that were reformed theologically, that were biblical, those kinds of things. So he ends up creating Acts 29. And Mark Driscoll is the first church planter of that. And then Rick McKinley, and there were a couple other guys that were all kind of the early guys in that. And after several years, and the story is told on that other podcast, that David couldn't correct Mark. And he attempted to, and there just came a point at which they decided to part ways. Mark was an incredibly personally charismatic figure. He drew all kinds of really sharp young leaders to himself, and so there were lots of things going on. So David didn't want to kill that, and so then they reverted back to the Spanish River Network idea. And they would continue to plant or help finance Acts 29 churches. But they also then had this network that was not specifically related to Acts 29. Over the years and up to the current time, Spanish River has helped plant 609 churches across the world. And right now, I think we're funding somewhere around 50 church plants. We take on about 20 a year. We're hoping to double that, within the next several years to, be able to take on 40 or 50 new projects, every single year. And the Lord's providing funding for that. So that's basically the story of Spanish River. I feel like I can easily talk about Spanish River because from my perspective, it's them. It's not me. These guys have done amazing stuff.
Incredible. Yeah,
the lay leaders and the staff of Spanish River has been incredible. They've been amazingly generous. For years, they put aside 20% of their entire budget allocated just to church planting.
Unbelievable.
Which is in comparison to what a lot of other churches do. It's like, this is kind of unheard of. So that's the basic story. If you want more, I can tell you more.
That is awesome. Well, I'd love to pick two things out of that. One is the focus on and the wisdom around next generation leader development. And then secondly, the focus on indigenous pastors and leader development. If you could distill Spanish River's wisdom from all those years and say to us at this point, guys, here's how I would encourage you to learn these lessons from Spanish River's experience, what might you say along those lines?
Well, Kent, I'm going to be a little bit of a politician, and I'm going to answer a slightly different question, if you don't mind. And so this is a kind of a blend of the city story as well as the Spanish River story. Good. Although it can be a very positive thing for someone to leave his or her own culture and go to another place and do ministry, the kind of the downside of that is often that the person that's coming from outside the culture often will not really understand the nuances of the culture they're going to. And we really saw this in the UK. And so many times American missionaries would come over, godly people, well-motivated, all that kind of thing. But they thought, and many times they thought that the British culture was basically the same as America, but they just speak with an accent. That's not true.
That's right.
And so many Americans actually have not done well in the UK, which is surprising, actually, to me. But it's because they don't quite understand those nuances. So if we can come alongside of, or if we could come alongside of, young indigenous leaders, usually age 22 to 35, some, a little bit older than that, they'll have a better understanding of their own culture, the nuances of that. If we can help equip them, they can then, I would use the term, parse their culture in a better way than an outsider would, and figure out how the gospel applies to the cultural narratives that drive the cultures that they're in. So the idea of investing in young leaders is incredibly important. So now I want to take it a step further, although you may be asking a question like this later. But my exposure to campus outreach initially came in Charlotte, where there was a good ministry that was functioning there. They decided that they wanted to try to do some work in South Africa.
Right.
And so a team went over there, really great team in many ways. And at one point, the leader of that ministry gave me a call because we had met in Charlotte at Christ Covenant. He gave me a call and he said, listen, I really want you to think about Say City coming down here and helping to plant several churches. Because at that point, they were seeing about 100 kids, these university students, come to Christ every year. I mean, it was phenomenal. But they were perplexed because they felt like there weren't the kind of churches present that could really adopt those kids or have those young leaders come into their churches and really get it. Because either the churches had that kind of colonial feel, either from the Afrikaans or from the British or something along those lines, or a lot of them were syncretistic. And what was happening in South Africa or in Africa was that South Africa had to meet any number of quotas for middle management and then upper management over a period of years post-apartheid. And so what the companies were doing, I mean, these companies are smart. They were combing through the continent of Africa and identifying the best and brightest leaders at age 16, at age 17, age 18, and then offering them bursaries to come down to the leading universities in South Africa, in Cape Town, Stellenbosch, Johannesburg, Pretoria. And then those young leaders would be trained, and then they would be obligated to work for the company for 4 years or something like that. So here you have all these black Africans, highly educated, young women, young men, very, very smart people that are working for the major banks, the mining companies, all those kinds of things. And there wasn't a church that both got their culture as well as got their theology. And so what CO did was they were saying, we need another kind of a church. We need a church for the new South Africa. So I went down, and the guys there gave me like an 1.5 inch thick file of information on South Africa. It was fascinating. I mean, those guys did an incredible good job of basically laying out the case for me. So we decided that we would engage in South Africa, really because of Campus Outreach's presence and then helping to plant churches. And we were moderately successful. Some of the churches didn't really work out as well as we hoped, but others were incredibly effective. And that gave rise to, really through CO's ministry, they developed all kinds of leaders that would then go on to plant churches 7 years later, 10 years later. So that's kind of the story of the younger leaders, the next gen young leaders that would have the ability to actually form effective churches within a culture. So
great. Well, there's an aspect there, Al, that I'd really like for you to speak to because of Campus Outreach's commitment to the local church. The experience that most students would have and most staff would have would be to be members and serving and worshiping at an existing church. And so sometimes the idea of planting new churches is a little bit off of the radar screen. But yet, just as you said, around the world, we're seeing these just armies of young believers coming to faith. What they've experienced on the campus has been missional discipleship, where they're focused on growing personally.
That's right.
They're learning how to share their faith. And then as they go out, it has seemed to us, and this evidence is mostly anecdotal, but it seems to us that they function really well in a church planting environment because it has such a missional focus and bias to it. So although you would think, oh, Campus Outreach ought to get church planting just straight away, I don't think that we always do. So could you speak to our staff to say, casting a vision for this could be the importance of church planting over the next 20 years? What could that look like?
Well, let me try to answer that in a couple different ways. So one, I think because of the posture of campus outreach, that it wants to be and usually is embedded in local churches.
That's right.
That lifts the profile of the church up. It helps the church have a better kind of orientation, in the community, that kind of thing. What I've seen now a little bit in Birmingham, England, but I know you guys have begun doing some stuff there, and I saw this in South Africa, and I've seen it now in a couple other places. Because you're coming, in effect, as servants to the indigenous churches.
That's right.
That actually really helps.
Okay.
And so then it gives a pathway for young leaders who might aspire to do ministry, either as pastors or in some other capacity. It gives them a pathway to figure out how to do that through the local church. So it's not working at cross purposes with a church, which sometimes that's what happens with parachurch ministries. Usually not intentionally. This is even maybe a problem that I see sometimes with CO. Usually, in order for you guys to do what you need to do in terms of spiritual formation, you've got to get that student involved in 3, 4, 5 different activities, basically almost every week. And so that is consumptive in terms of their time. So it's many times, even though they'll attend a church, it's hard to get fully integrated,
That's right.
But that's just one of the things that you guys always have to be aware of and trying to figure out, okay, how do we actually push them toward integration with these churches so that that lasting pathway comes there. The second thing I'd want to say there is in so many cities now, the opportunity and the need, I would say, for campus ministry is almost off the charts. So, one of the cities, you probably heard me talk about this before, one of the cities that is just a great illustration is Lagos, Nigeria.
That's right.
And even 7 years ago, Nigeria or Lagos was 20 million in population and forecasted to be 45 million by mid-century,
right.
by either 2045, 2050. Now think about that. Adding 20 million people to a city, and the average age will be 16. How many churches do you need, even if you're just trying to process believers who are moving to the city, and many of them are not? How many churches do you need to reach an additional 20 million people, or to keep the proportion the same?
Exactly.
Even just to keep up, it takes a lot of churches, and I'm not going to do the multiplication for you guys, but the average church is 100. You can kind of figure out how many it would take. But where are those leaders going to come from? I'll tell you where they're going to come from. They're going to come from vibrant children's ministry, vibrant high school ministry, and vibrant campus ministry.
That's right.
If we don't have campus ministries on the leading universities of even that one city, let alone the 30 other cities in Africa that are doubling or tripling in size within the next 20 years, we could easily lose the culture.
That's right.
And so we desperately need campus ministers, and they can be from any number of places in the world. But the welcoming presence for CO workers or others, Young Life workers or whatever, it's a wide open door. And so I'd love to see us send 10,000 North Americans, to do campus ministry in the cities of Africa alone.
That's right.
And I do think that's the gateway into the UK. I think it's the gateway into Australia, into New Zealand, and many of the other English-speaking parts of the world. And wherever we can, if you guys can develop Mandarin-speaking groups and Hindi-speaking groups and Farsi-speaking groups, that would be amazing, I think. So just there's an incredible opportunity that we need to try to respond to.
We're taking a break from our conversation to focus on our movement spotlight. This season, we will hear from staff from different campus outreach regions as they share a few recent highlights and prayer requests. In today's Movement Spotlight, we will hear from Campus Outreach Charleston, under the authority of East Cooper Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Sweat, and I serve as the Event and Communication Coordinator in the Campus Outreach Charleston Resource Office. We are in the midst of our semester, and the Lord has already shown us some really sweet fruit that we get to share with you guys. We've seen multiple students who went on our Alpha Project come to campus with the zeal to share their faith with their peers and classmates. One student in particular on the cross-country team at Charleston Southern was evangelizing to her teammate and got to see her accept faith in Jesus just a few weeks ago, which was really sweet. Another student from Coastal Carolina came into school as an atheist but accepted Christ last semester. He also went on the Alpha Project, and he has been eager in sharing his faith and teaching his non-believing friends who Jesus is and how to read the Bible. And our other campuses have been really encouraged to see multiple student-led Bible studies and D groups. So you guys can join us in prayer for our campuses in Charleston. One, that our ministry would have favor in reaching interested non-believers, and two, pray that the gospel would continue to spread within the sports teams and other affinity groups on our campuses. So thank you guys for listening, and thank you all for your labor in God's kingdom.
Let's take a minute to pray for CO Charleston. Father God, creator of all mankind, giver of life, we thank you for opening our eyes to see and know Jesus Christ, the author of our salvation. We pray for CO Charleston and their campus ministries to continue to experience your blessings of new life in so many. Thank you for giving these believers the desire to spend their time sharing the gospel, opening the Bible with their peers in Bible studies, and discipling other Christians in faith and obedience. Please, Lord, continue to spread the gospel through these staff and students. May the Spirit give them favor among unbelievers, athletes, and within other affinity groups on campus. We trust you and ask in Jesus' name for your glory. Amen.
Al, that next thing I wanted to ask you about is, for years I have come to you and asked the question, what's going on out there in the world that we need to know about? And you've been such a generous and kind responder to that question. I'd love for you to answer that today for our staff around the world. What are the top 3, 4, 5 things you're seeing happening in the global church that at a minimum we ought to be praying about or encouraged by? Just what are you seeing happen out there?
This comes back to kind of our bread and butter at City to City. Still, the cities are growing at an incredible rate. I've even mentioned this, that many of the African cities are doubling about every 7 to 12 years. And so there you're talking about a city of 7 million becoming 14 million. You're talking about a city of 15 million becoming perhaps 30. Some of those cities will number, nearly 100 million people by the end of the century. Yeah. So there's an incredible need there. And within the cities of Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, pretty much everywhere, there is an openness to the gospel, which is extraordinary. Because as people move from the countryside or from some other place into a city, they often become open spiritually. They're no longer surrounded by family. They're no longer constricted by social restraints that would keep them from investigating something new. And so if there are believers there that are winsomely preaching the gospel, exposing people to the love of Christ, we will see kind of an amazing harvest. Right now, the only place, and it's probably changed a little bit since I got this stat, but one of the only cities in Europe that is actually growing in the number of people who actually believe in Christ is London.
That's right.
They're growing percentage-wise, but they're also growing actually the hard numbers. I think that's beginning. The tide is turning in Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dublin, Belfast, all those cities, we're seeing a resurgence of real Christianity take place. In a city like Athens, one of the most difficult cities in Europe, we've seen, kind of surprisingly, more than 10 churches planted in the last 7 or 8 years. That's incredibly good in a very Orthodox type of culture. In Budapest, Hungary, we've seen 22 churches planted over the last, about 10 years or so. There's just a hunger there. And there's a hunger for what I would call a biblical understanding of the gospel. The different way to describe that is a reformed understanding of the gospel. Yeah. Is that's becoming more well-known. People are receiving it. So the second thing I'd want to say is there's a huge opportunity now, particularly in Africa or African-related populations across the world. There is an incredible weariness with prosperity theology. Many of the leaders are actually tired of it. They know it doesn't work. They're not quite sure what the real gospel is. So it's not like a hostility. Right. But this is the only form of Christianity that they've ever kind of seen. But something's missing. Yeah. And so one of the guys that we know that's in Abidjan, which is the capital of Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, he pastors a mega church. About 5 years ago, he got exposed to the gospel of grace, and he said, this is it. And right now, he's influencing a group of probably 400 or more pastors, many of them are megachurch pastors, that they're all listening to what he's saying about the gospel. And so they're abandoning prosperity theology and replacing it with a healthy understanding of the gospel. Now, they still may be charismatic in some of their leanings, but it's spot on. Grace, straightforward gospel. We're seeing some of the more legalistic denominations in Africa. Their main leaders are, in essence, being kind of converted. That's probably the wrong, not the right word, but they're receiving the gospel. There was a leader of a Baptist denomination in Cameroon. He came to a deal in Nairobi. The guy that was speaking was Toby Meyer.
Yes.
And Toby Meyer, after Toby got done speaking, the session on what is the gospel. Now, here's a 50-year-old guy. He leads a denomination of 300 pastors. And after this guy, says, "Hey, is there any way that I can have lunch with you?" Because they were going right to lunch. And Toby said, "Yeah." And here's what this guy said. He said, "I don't know how to explain what I think just happened to me. But as you were talking, I began to think or realize that I don't know that I've ever really understood the gospel before."
Wow.
Of course, he knows Christ crucified,
Yes.
But it's kind of a transactional type of thing, and it's kind of legalistic a little bit. But he said, as you were talking about, I began to understand it. And at one point, I felt this strange kind of warmth come over me. A little bit like John Wesley.
Exactly, yeah.
They talk for a while, but then he ends up saying that, I'm going to go back to Cameroon, and I'm going to try to make sure that every single one of the 300 men that are under me understand the gospel. And I'm going to start trying to preach the gospel myself, and I'm going to try to make sure that all of our guys begin really preaching the gospel.
That's awesome.
Because this is what will actually transform people's lives.
That's right.
There's incredible opportunity. There's amazing things going on in India, even despite the persecution. The things in China continue to just be explosive. And now as Mandarin speakers are moving into other places of the world, there are Mandarin speaking churches being planted in all kinds of places. So one of the guys that we know that we're helping, he wants to plant 15 Mandarin speaking churches on the West Coast alone, from San Diego up to Seattle. There's not one Mandarin, there hasn't been one Mandarin speaking PCA congregation until this guy is planting in Irvine.
Wow.
And immediately, within 1 year, I think he's got a congregation of 150 people.
Sure.
And they're hungry for the gospel. I mean, it's just incredible stuff. So,
This season, we are capping our episodes to a shorter length per episode, but with so much amazing content from our guests, we want to make sure we don't miss anything. Because of that, we will be splitting some interviews into 2 episodes, Part 1 and Part 2, and we will publish both parts at the same time. So, if you have time right now and want to hear the second part of our conversation with Al Barth, just jump to the next episode. If you need to wait until a little later, make sure you are subscribed to the show on your favorite podcasting service to continue listening. The Campus Outreach Staffcast is a production of Campus Outreach Serve. The vision of Campus Outreach is to glorify God by building laborers on the campus for the lost world. To learn more, visit www.campusoutreach.org.